Your word. Help us to be transformed by all that you would teach us in your infinite wisdom. Gracious Lord, we ask that you do these things in spite of me or through me. For this we pray. Amen. So, for those of you who have not been here, we are in the middle of a series on the book of Job, and in particular the suffering of Job. This is the 5th week of the series. We have 1 week left after this one. And for the past 5 weeks we have looked at kind of the story of Job, the story of the life of Job. We started about 4 weeks ago with talking about how Job was considered to be one of the most righteous persons that ever walked the earth, according to the story. He was a man of great wealth who was blessed by God with many livestock and servants. He had a family of 7 sons and 3 daughters and a wonderful wife, and his family loved each other and were righteous and were upright before the Lord. He had good health. And then one day, according to the story, our antagonist, our Satan, takes notice of Job, and he gets permission to afflict him, we'll say. And so all of Job's livestock are stolen. All of his servants are killed. His sons and 3 daughters all perish when the house collapses upon them and kills them instantly. And he still finds the strength and courage to thank God for the blessings that he had received. And so the Satan comes to God again and asks to afflict him more, to see if he can shake his faith. And so Satan gets permission and comes back, and he strikes Job with wounds from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet that bleed and ooze and that cause him pain and itch. And Satan touches his bones and disfigures him in his bones and causes him to be in continual and constant pain, excruciating agony. And he makes it so where Job can't eat and hold food in. And so Job is left sitting on an ash pile, naked, unable to wear clothing because of his wounds. His wife comes up to him and says, "Curse God so that he may kill you. I'm done." And he's left there. We then moved into the next week and we talked about Job's depression and how he cursed the day he was born, that he should suffer so much. 2 weeks ago, we talked about his friends then showing up. Some of them offering shallow platitudes, words that meant well but had no spiritual depth and did not provide any comfort. Or his friends that chose to tell him, "Job, this is all your fault. Obviously you have done something wrong. You are not the righteous man that we all thought you were. God is punishing you because you must be a sinner." Last week, after his first round of friends show up, Job finally moves kind of from his depression and moved into a state of anger, and he challenges God and lashes out at God and blames God. "Why, God, are you striking down the innocent along with the wicked? Clearly, you are not a just God, a God that is fair, but instead a God that is completely arbitrary. You strike down the innocent with the wicked. How can I challenge you, God? It is not fair. We are not on equal footing. You have all the power and I have nothing. Would I could take you to court and have my righteousness affirmed." For 30 chapters, Job kind of deals with his anger, his crying out to God, and and continues to have his friends show up and try to convince him of their theologies of how it's his fault and all various other manners of conversation, none of them particularly productive. And then finally they leave him alone, and Job is left there on his ash pile. And a storm happens overhead. And then from the storm comes a voice. Who is it that would contend with the Almighty? Who has been speaking out against me? And Job reacts the way that I think that most of us probably would act, or at least the way I'd like to think most of us would react. If we were to be the person who is there cursing out God, and suddenly a storm appeared and a voice from heaven answered back and says, who is daring to challenge and condemn God? He says he's speechless. And he responds to God, I cannot say anything else. Actually, I've said things and I will say no more. I cannot answer. I am insignificant compared to you. God must have been pretty terrifying in that storm. But God continues on. He's not going to let Job quite off the hook that easily. Gird up your loins like a man. In other words, get ready because it's coming. Who, Job, can you clothe yourself in grace and majesty? Can you actually have power over your life? Job? Or Job, do you have power over the proud? Can you humble them and knock them down a peg or two? Job, can you condemn the wicked? Can you throw them into the bowels of hell or put them to death? Do you have this power, Job? Tell me, because if you do, Job, then I will confess to you that you have the power to save yourself. Nothing? Job, let me tell you about Behemoth. Behemoth I made. Behemoth is this strong creature. Job, you've heard of him, you've seen him. His muscles are immense. His skin is like armor, and there is nothing that you can do to pierce it. He hides in the reeds and in the marshes. He takes shade in the lotus plants. You see, Job, despite how great and scary and terrible this beast, this first of beasts that I have made is, he still relies on me for food and shelter, and I provide it. Job, can you stand up to me like with his strength, like he can? Job, how about Leviathan? The great beast of the water. Can your javelins and your spears, your knives pierce his hide? Can you catch him with a fishhook? Can you reel him into your boat, Job? This great beast who can blow water out with his breath, who can swallow up seas, whose sheer size is larger than anything you've ever seen built. Can you do anything with Leviathan? Because I take care of Leviathan. I created him. What have you created, Job? And he continues to talk about the power of his creations. And in the end, Job begins to better understand God. You see, God did not come down and speak to Job in a way to punish him. He doesn't sit there and afflict Job with any more maladies. But instead, he responds to Job and lets Job know who he is. You see, he's a God who has created a great and many wonderful things. And as great and wonderful as we are as people, there are many that are mightier, many that are greater in power and in strength that God has created, and yet God still has to care for even them, just as he cares for us and for Job. He reminds Job through these stories that all that Job has had has always been given to him by God, and that there is nothing that we give unto God that isn't already his. It's not that we don't have a right to question God. But when we question God, we must reflect on who it is that we think we can replace God with. Because as Creator, God is the Almighty, the All-Powerful. God is the very definition of justice and goodness, of mercy and righteousness. Job, upon hearing these stories, repents for ever doubting God. And we'll get to that next week. He repents for ever assuming that God would punish the innocent, or that God was doing these things to him. Not that he had done anything else wrong, or that he had been a sinful man or anything. He was the righteous man that he was proclaimed to be. But for a moment, he had forgot to trust God. Luckily, he still remained in relationship with God. And that opened the door for God's response. As a people of faith, this should be what we take from the story of Job. That it is the most important thing for us to do, to remain in contact and relationship with God. When we are depressed, we should come to God and lay down our concerns at his feet. When we are angry, we can beat on his chest, and he may even respond. And it won't be a response of punishment, but it may be a firm moment of teaching where we are reminded once again of just how great and majestic God is, and how little that we could do if we were to have to replace him. Because he is a God that has cared for us and loves us. And he is a God that continually provides for us and all the creatures that he loves and cares for. All that he has made. It is when we continue to keep that relationship that we are able to continue to allow God to speak into us and to make amends to the relationship that we try to sunder. And in making amends, we are able to find God's full salvation. And we are able to realize the full potential of his ability to restore us, redeem us, and make amends for all of the pain and the sorrow and the suffering that we have experienced here in these bodies and in this life. It is only through that relationship, that continued relationship, that we can find that restoration. Because outside of God, we have no power. Outside of God, there is nothing. So may we be a people that seek out God in our best of moments and in our worst of moments. Because in best or worst, we continue to build and grow closer to Him, who can do all things and loves all things.